Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics, and today we're covering sections 9.1 and 9.2, Monopoly. In this module, you will learn to explain natural resource and legal barriers to entry, how to solve profit maximization for a monopolist, and how to evaluate efficiency under a monopoly. So, to begin our discussion of monopoly, the first thing we have to talk about is why, once those monopolists earn big profits, and spoiler alert, monopolies do earn big profits, does new competition not enter the market and compete those profits away like you might see in perfect competition? And the answer is that there's some factor that prevents competition from entering into a monopoly situation, which collectively are referred to as barriers to entry in economics. They fall into a couple of major categories. The first couple are very easy to understand, but frankly, they are either not that common, or if they do exist, we're sort of doing them on purpose, so there is a trade-off there, whether the monopoly in this case even presents a problem. Which brings us to our first category, which would be legal monopolies. Now you can basically split those into two major categories. Sometimes we give a monopoly to a company on a permanent basis. So we don't do that very often because normally we're not a huge fan of the market outcomes that monopoly gives us. But a huge federal example here, for example, would of course be the United States Postal Service. And you can give a couple of different justifications for why we might have that particular monopoly. Maybe you want to argue that it's a natural monopoly anyway, like we'll discuss in just a minute here. And in such a case, it might be better to have it in government hands. Or perhaps you want to make an argument about a universal service objective or a constitutional obligation. The point is, we're doing this one on purpose. In a similar category, but on a more temporary basis, we have monopolies that fall under the umbrella term intellectual property. So, for example, if you invent that better mousetrap, the incentive for inventing it is, of course, that we will grant you a patent if you apply for it on this mousetrap, which for 20 years gives you a monopoly on selling that particular design, or gives you the option of licensing that design for money to other companies. And the basic idea is that without that sort of intellectual property protection, what's the incentive to design the mousetrap to begin with? Because once you've got it on the market, everybody else can just copy it, so all your development efforts are sort of down the drain. In a similar vein, if you don't want to patent that mousetrap, you could also decide to keep the underlying design a secret. Okay, that's going to be a little bit hard with a mousetrap, but maybe with you using the mousetraps in your own mousetrapping service, then you can, keep it out of competitions and customers' hands. And in that case, you are allowed to keep this a secret, and just, stealing that information from you would in fact leave them open to some sort of civil suit from your side. In a similar vein to the patents, those are for inventions, we've got copyright that covers creative expressions, your books, your movies, your music, and so on and so forth. Those of course last much longer. You can even argue about how well we're striking a balance there when it comes to a temporary protection, but we're talking about more than 90 years depending on the specifics. But again, there's supposed to be an incentive effect here. Now, we do have a couple of other barriers to entry that can happen that are not a so-called natural monopoly, that we are perhaps less fond of, and where we might even want to interfere a little bit and restore competition. And those would be resource monopolies and monopolies caused by predatory pricing. Now, resource monopolies, I'll be very honest with you, I struggle to even come up with a great example here because they are quite rare. But the fundamental idea is that if a particular product requires a so-called key resource in its production, a key resource is a resource that's absolutely necessary, you can't switch away from it, then theoretically a company could lock up ownership of that key resource and thereby lock out all competition. So economists here love to run to the example of the De Beers Mining Company because it owns a significant chunk of the world's diamond mines, which of course are arguably a key resource in producing diamonds. But they don't even own a majority of the mines, and you could argue that synthetic diamonds are becoming more of a competitive element when it comes to ordinary mined gemstone diamonds. So even this best example I can think of is not that great. But hey, it could happen. Now, predatory pricing, that's, something we're sometimes more concerned about, where the idea is if a company currently enjoys a monopoly, perhaps they can establish a credible reputation that if you compete with them, they're willing to go way low on price and cause everybody to earn losses. But because they are established, they are basically betting on you going out of business first, and then they can raise those prices back up. Now, obviously, that's a very dangerous strategy, right? Because you are doing something that's bad for yourself in the short run there as the monopolist defending your turf, in order to get a long-run better outcome. So this really comes down to whether you can credibly commit to take such an action and establish enough of a reputation that new entrants won't even try to compete with you. So again, you can argue a little bit to what extent that happens in real life, but this one is certainly something we're concerned enough about that it is illegal to engage in such behavior. But now, let us get to the one that I consider most interesting, because the natural monopoly situation is basically the reason that we will always have to deal with monopolies in economics, even in future market types that haven't even been invented yet, because it simply comes down to the supply or demand economics of the market tending towards one company dominating the entire market. And on the one hand, over on the supply side, we can have that when there are huge economies of scale, such that it is not viable for more than one company to provide the service. So for example, if you think of the electricity delivery to your house or your apartment, when it comes to the delivery, you only have choice from one company. In other words, no choice at all, as long as you want electricity. And that's of course because delivering an electricity takes a big electric network, big fixed cost to establish that network, but if you've got that network in place, hooking up an additional house or apartment is relatively cheap. We'll look at that graphically in just a second, but even if you just approach it from a logical standpoint, what would competition in electricity delivery even look like? We'd have, 3, 4, 5 separate companies all digging their own electric lines and then multiple hookups to the houses. That's clearly not an efficient outcome. Now, we can also have a more advanced type of natural monopoly over on the demand side. We are not going to go into this, but I do want to mention it because I think these are becoming more important here in our digital age, and those are so-called network effects. So sometimes the value of a product, not the provision thereof, but the value of the product to the buyer increases when more people are buying the product from the same company. So you've got this runaway effect where basically the biggest company has the most valuable product simply because it's biggest, attracts more customers until it eventually dominates the market, and you can't take that over in one fell swoop. So a classic example here would be a closed social network, like a Facebook or something like that, right? Why are people on Facebook? Because it's got the most convincingly technological superior product? I mean, maybe, sure, they're putting a lot of money into the product, right? But I'd say the fundamental underlying reason is because all the other users that are on Facebook. So in order to displace Facebook, you would basically either have to take the entire user base at once, or you would have to establish a network that's different enough that there would be like a whole separate reason for people to switch over to your network. Doesn't mean that it can't happen, right? Like you'd give this talk here more than a decade ago, and perhaps you'd be talking about MySpace being basically an unassailable network effect, natural monopoly. So yes, they can be displaced, but it's super, super hard. So let's go back to that more traditional type of natural monopoly where we're talking about economies of scale. Basically, what we're talking about is the average total cost of providing a product. So here's a long-run average total cost curve with its 3 standard sections. We've got the beginning here, where if you produce more, your average cost fall. That's your economies of scale section. We've got a flat middle section where you have constant returns to scale. And then eventually in most industries, companies can in fact grow too big to be efficient. And our final section here is referred to as diseconomies of scale. Now, what of course happens is that in competition, when you have many companies competing with one another, everybody is forced to operate at low cost. So everybody has to be sort of in this constant return to scale range here in this example, producing between 8 and 20,000 units. So if you're looking at a market where perhaps the total market size is 2 million units per year, then you can have 100 or more companies all competing while being at an efficient level of production. That's competition. But let's say we're not looking at a market that's huge like that, but instead a market where there is a much smaller total market size. So let's say we're looking at the average total cost of operating a utility like an electric network, and we're doing this for a very small town here that only has a couple of thousand people in it. So we superimpose the demand curve for the town, and it's still for the entire market on the downward sloping section of this average total cost curve. So what's going on here? If we have one company serving the entire market, 5,000 houses, by definition, they are on the lowest section of the average cost curve you can reach. And if you have a company trying to compete with them that has any less quantity than that, their cost will be much higher and they will be by definition uncompetitive. So that's your basic economies of scale natural monopoly, a situation where one firm can supply the product at a lower cost than many firms competing with one another. And that means sooner or later one firm gets a runaway advantage and becomes a permanent monopolist in this market, for at least as long as the market exists. And you might imagine, with electric transmission, that's certainly a technology that's been going strong for well over 100 years, and we sort of continue to expect to go strong. All right, so these are the fundamental reasons why you might have a monopoly to begin with. And now let's get to the real heart of the issue. When it comes to efficiency, the thing we concern ourselves with in economics, monopolies don't produce nice outcomes like perfect competition does. And the absolutely fundamental reason for that is how the revenue of a monopolist behaves. So we're now going to look at revenue here a couple of times in a row to really drive this point home. When you think about the revenue of a firm, let's talk about a firm increasing how much it sells. When the firm increases how much it sells, here's what happens to its revenue. Number one, what we refer to as the output effect. Selling more units means you get more revenue because you now have units that give you money that before you weren't producing. Very simple. So this happens in any market type, including perfect competition that we discussed previously and monopoly that we're discussing today. But then there's a potential second effect, the price effect of producing more. If you have market power and you produce additional units, in order to sell these additional units, you have to lower the price of the product, or simply producing more lowers the price of the product. Now, that does not happen in perfect competition, because in perfect competition, you face a perfectly elastic demand curve. You can sell as much as you want. You don't matter to that market. You don't affect the market price at all. And when you first hear that, it almost sounds like a firm would be better off operating in perfect competition. Hey, you can sell as much as you want, you don't affect the price. But that's of course not what ends up being the end result here. As we will see a little bit down the road, what monopolists can do and will do that perfectly competitive companies cannot do is they deliberately hold back how much they produce in order to charge a higher price. They hold back on production to charge a higher price. Okay, before we get to that, let's look at revenue a couple more times. So in a previous module, we looked at the demand curves in a perfectly competitive market. Now, I say demand curves because you can have two perspectives here. So number one, you can look at the individual demand of a company in a perfectly competitive market. The individual company here is what we call a price taker. And what that means is we look at their demand curve. At the individual level, it's a horizontal line. There's a market price determined by supply and demand that the perfectly competitive company has to take as given. And at that price, they can sell any amount, but they try to charge even a little bit more. Nobody buys from them anymore. Perfect competition. Now, that's not to say that the market demand curve is horizontal, right? You look at the market as a whole, it's got a standard downward sloping demand curve. There's a trade-off between price and quantity. But from the perspective of the individual company, that trade-off doesn't exist. But now, look at a monopoly. A monopoly literally faces the market demand curve. So we're talking about the market demand curve. We're talking about the individual demand curve that a monopolist faces. It's literally the same picture. And we've got that price and quantity trade-off. Let's look at that numerically next. So here is a hypothetical company, Health Pill, and just to keep the math simple here, the quantities are just going to range from 1 to 8. But because this company faces the entire market demand curve, you can see that the price at which their pill sells is not constant. If they want to sell a greater quantity of pills, they have to charge a lower price. We're looking at the entire market demand curve. So numerically, look at what happens to the revenue of that company. So revenue is, of course, quantity times price. We see that if you sell more, revenue increases, but not in a straight line like it would for a perfectly competitive company. And eventually you can even get to this almost paradoxical result where if you sell more of your product, revenue actually decreases. We're not talking about profit here, right? Profit's revenue minus cost. All sorts of companies, if they sell too much, cost goes up too much, profit falls. We're talking about revenue. You can get to a point where selling more units actually results in people giving you fewer dollars for that product. So that is unique to companies that have market power, such as a monopoly, strongest form of market power you can have. That would not happen in perfect competition. Let me show you a graph of this as well. If we graph up the total revenue of our monopolist here, where for a perfectly competitive company, total revenue is a straight line through the origin, unit elastic. For a monopolist, you see here the slope on that revenue decreases, and it can even go negative, where selling more units lowers the revenue of your company. So of course, if we want to look at the profit maximizing decision of a monopolist, we want to go ahead and look at the situation at the margin. Marginal revenue, change in total revenue over change in quantity. Quantity for this company always goes up by 1 unit at a time. So we can sort of shortcut that here and just look at the change in total revenue. So I've given you the first pill, or the second one to be precise here already. If we go from selling 1 to 2 pills, the second pill makes revenue increase by $1,000. And then something interesting we'll get to in a second. So notice that's less than the price of the product. There's something going on here. But first, let's look at the marginal revenue a little bit more. So going to pill number 3, $3,000 in revenue. So if we want to sell 3 pills, we have to charge $1,000 maximum. And even though we're charging $1,000 here, the additional revenue from the third pill, only $800, right? One more time here, going from pill 3 to pill 4, notice marginal revenue not a constant number. The marginal revenue is dropping. And as opposed to perfect competition, also not equal to the price. So sort of 2 ways in which it's different from perfect competition. Perfect competition, price is steady, marginal revenue is steady, and they are the same number. Monopoly, price falls as you sell more, marginal revenue falls as you sell more, and they are not the same number. Marginal revenue is less. We see that all the way here going down the final revenue steps, including sort of this crazy result at the end, where if you sell more pills, your marginal revenue can actually turn negative. Your revenue might fall. So let me look at a specific step here to really illustrate what's going on. Let's say we're looking at lowering our price from $900 to $800, or in other words, going from 4 to 5 customers, whichever way you like to think about this. And let me really break apart what happens to our revenue when we do that. So possibility number 1, at a price of $900, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 customers that say, yes, I will buy a pill, which of course means 1, 2, 3, 4 customers, $900 each, they're giving us $3,600 of revenue. Then over here at the margin, we've got our potential 5th customer, but she's saying no at the $900 price. Now we're going to go ahead and lower that price down to $800. So here we go at $800, of course, our previous 4 people, yes, 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 yes. If they want to buy at 900, they're still buying at 800. And now we have our 1 additional customer here that says, okay, yes, I'm also in. Let's go ahead and buy the product. So let's count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 customers, $800 each. We're getting $4,000 worth of revenue, right? So we've got a 5th customer. She's giving us $800, but our revenue is not rising by that full $800. So let's take this apart. She is giving us $800, right? That's $800 more than we're getting from her than we did at the price of $900, because at the price of $900, we were getting nothing from her. This is what we call the output effect in economics. You sell more units, somebody's giving you money that beforehand wasn't. But in the case of monopoly, our revenue is not rising by that whole $800, because in order to secure customer number 5 here, we have to lower price. And that of course means that the 4 people that are buying anyway, 1, 2, 3, 4, they are giving us less money. Instead of $900, only $800. That's $100 less from each of them. This is what we refer to as the price effect. And in perfect competition, you don't have an impact on price, so these numbers wouldn't appear. Now, we put this together, minus 100, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, plus 800. The net effect on our revenue is that it rises only $400 as the output and price effects are pushing against each other. This is the fundamental difference of how a monopoly's revenue behaves. Now, armed with this information, let's have a look at how we can apply profit maximization. Because of course, profit maximization is based off marginal revenue. And here you see the graph one more time. Is marginal revenue a horizontal line for the monopolist? Nope. It decreases. It can even go to the negatives. Let's go ahead and do profit maximization then, which of course means we have to think at the margin, and we're going to have to introduce total cost for this firm. So here are the total revenue numbers we saw just a minute ago, and then here are some total cost figures. They are just made up total cost figures, right? But they follow a pretty sensible pattern like you might often see a company exhibiting. And you could, of course, already sort of brute force this problem and see, hey, where's the difference between these numbers the biggest, right? Like somewhere down here. Or you could graph these two up and say, okay, here's a monopolist. Total revenue is not a straight line. It goes concave. And here's our cost, increasing slowly and then fast, as it often does. Let's find the biggest difference between those two lines. And we'd be able to do that. But of course, we want to apply our standard profit maximization rules from economics. So let's review that. In order to do profit maximization, we think at the margin. We will need revenue and cost at the margin, marginal revenue, marginal cost. Formulas for those, of course, change in total revenue over change in quantity and change in total cost over change in quantity. And then even though it is an average concept, as you know, it is handy to also take our formula for profit itself, total revenue minus total cost, and transform it into its average version, price minus average total cost times quantity, because then once we've solved the profit maximization problem, we can also calculate how much profit the company is earning. So all of this is familiar, but there's one new step. When we looked at profit maximization for a perfectly competitive company, the only step we had was step number 1, choose quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Great. Then for step 2, figuring out the price of your product, for a perfectly competitive company, there was no step 2 because it's a price taker. But now we're looking at a monopoly, and that means we have ourselves a price maker. The price isn't simply determined by the market because the monopoly owns the market. So that means we must choose a price, and that's going to be a relatively straightforward rule. That monopolist, once it has identified the profit maximizing quantity, is going to charge the highest price it can, where it can still sell that quantity. And you can look that up by looking at the demand curve for the product. That might already make sense to you, but of course we're going to practice this a number of times now. So let's go ahead and look at that. First, using the numbers. So here is our health pill company again, and we've already worked out marginal revenue beforehand. And this time, sort of for you, here is the marginal cost of that company. So in order to maximize our profits, step number 1, we want to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So 400, 400. Profit maximizing quantity occurs at, drumroll, 5 units is the level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, we could work out profit right now, right here. We've got total revenue, we've got total cost. Look at those two numbers, right? Got a difference of 2,350. But of course, I want to show you how to do this using averages so that we can all nicely combine it on our graphs as well. So, step number 2, let me take away the total revenue and the total cost and replace it with price and average total cost. Once again, we've got our profit max still at 5 units, $400 marginal revenue and marginal cost, and now we have to find the price to charge. So there's one little danger here. I almost don't want to say the wrong thing because then you might remember it, but what follows is the wrong thing. From perfect competition, you might be tempted to remember, hey, price and marginal revenue are the same number. So if I'm at the $400 marginal revenue here, that's the price I'm charging. Not for monopoly. For monopoly, price and marginal revenue are not the same number. So what you want to do is, once you've identified your marginal revenue and marginal cost, you have to look what is the price at this output level. And technically what we're saying here is price and quantity, of course, form our demand schedule. Technically what we're saying here is you have to look at your demand curve or demand schedule to find that price, because of course the monopolist could charge less and still sell that many units, but we're trying to maximize our profit here. So let's go ahead and plug that into our profit formula. On a per unit level, profit is price minus average total cost times quantity. We want to find the price. We found the price. The price is $800. We're going to go ahead and combine that with average total cost, $330. And after taking this difference here, multiplying it by the quantity, 5 units. So notice we're using all the info from the same row then, and price and marginal revenue are not the same number. So here's our profit. We've got an average profit of $470, the difference between 800 and 330. Multiply that by 5 units sold, and that gives you $2,350 in profit, just like we just found. Just like we just found. All right, let's look at the same problem graphically. So here is our same health pill company with all 4 relevant curves displayed. Let's orient ourselves a little bit. We have a demand curve that is downward sloping because it's the entire market demand curve. We calculated marginal revenue, which sits below that market demand curve. Marginal revenue and price, not the same thing when you're running a monopoly. And we have the average and marginal cost curves for our monopolist. So let's go through the steps. The first thing you want to identify is your profit maximizing quantity. So for that, you look, where is marginal revenue and marginal cost the same number? There's my marginal cost curve, there's my marginal revenue curve. Let's look for that intersection and we identify 5 units. That's how much we should make. And now comes that potentially dangerous step. Step number 2, find the price for your product. So here you don't simply look at that marginal revenue, marginal cost number. You want to go at 5 units all the way up to the demand curve, all the way up to here. And you identify $800 is how much we're going to be charging. Once you've solved your profit maximization problem, and this is the actual solution, you will make 5 units at a price of $800. We can now also handily find the amount of profit on our graph. For that, we use our profit formula, price minus average total cost. That gives you average profit. It's also going to be a height on this graph. Then we're going to multiply that by how many units we're producing. So first, price minus average total cost. Here's our price, 800. And now you want to, at 5 units, you want to take that all the way down to the average total cost curve. So notice that's not the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. We're doing price minus average total cost. That's what that 4th curve is for. And this difference right here, from 800 to 330, that's profit per unit. You now multiply that by the number of units you're selling. That's a horizontal distance, 5 units right here. 470 times 5 units. The resulting rectangle, height times width, is $2,350, or the profit this company is making. So you can see, once again, you can do profit maximization of the graph, same as you could for perfect competition, but there's a little bit more going on because you have to identify the price by going up to the demand curve. That's the major difference, really. We'll practice that one more time in just a second. But second time we do that, I also want to combine this with looking at our judgment of how much we like monopoly from a social perspective. And the answer here is not very much at all. So the basic problem that monopoly gives us is that it isn't efficient from an allocation standpoint. Reminder, we have this concept called allocative efficiency, which basically means, is a market or whatever other economic system you choose to use giving the right amount of product to the people who value it the most? And we say a market is efficient in an allocation sense if everybody is allocated product that values it in a willingness to pay sense at or above the cost of making another unit of that product, at or above marginal cost. So what that means is, if everybody who values the product at or above marginal cost gets it, then the last person who is still allocated the product, that's where price and marginal cost are going to be just the same number. That's what we're looking for when it comes to allocative efficiency. We want the price of that product to fall to marginal cost. We want the last person who buys the product to be paying just exactly what it takes to produce the last unit of that product, and then we have generated maximum efficiency from allocation. Now let me show you, even though we've looked at it before, why perfect competition pulls this off. And it's like an itty-bitty mathematical proof. Basically, perfect competition has two conditions going on. Condition number one, companies in perfect competition are price takers. That means price and marginal revenue are the same number. They're equal. They're facing a horizontal individual demand curve, which is also the marginal revenue curve for that perfectly competitive firm. That's number one. We put that together with number two, perfectly competitive company maximizing profit in the market does so where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So at profit max, you put these two together, price equals marginal revenue and marginal revenue equals marginal cost. What are you left with? Price is equal to marginal cost. Transitivity, right? So allocative efficiency achieved. And now over here, we're going to look at our monopolist. And of course, a monopolist is a price maker. As we already looked at numerically and graphically, the demand curve price is higher than marginal revenue. Think back to the health pill example. It was selling at a marginal revenue of 400, but a price of 800, a much bigger number. Now it's still following the same profit maximization rule. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But once again, we put those two conditions together and we are left with the implication that for monopoly, price is greater than marginal cost. So if price is greater than marginal cost, if it doesn't fall to marginal cost, that means there are some people who value the product more than it would cost to produce another one, but they don't get the product. That's a fail when it comes to allocative efficiency. So one more time, let's practice how to do profit maximization for monopolist. And we're going to put that together here with just keeping the allocative efficiency idea in the back of our mind. Here is one more monopolist with its 4 relevant curves. So again, notice, you're not looking at a perfectly competitive company because the individual demand curve of the monopolist is the same as the market demand curve is downward sloping, which means marginal revenue is going to be sitting entirely below that demand curve. And then we've got marginal cost to figure out the profit maximizing quantity. We've got average total cost to figure out how much profit this company is making. So let's go through our 2-step process. Step number 1, identify the correct quantity. So for that one, profit maximization, we look at marginal revenue and marginal cost. Where they equal, right here we've got ourselves an intersection. Take that down to the x-axis. There's our profit maximizing quantity. Then comes step number 2, now find the price. And the price, of course, is going to be much higher than marginal revenue. You're going to go all the way up to the demand curve up here. Much higher price than marginal revenue or marginal cost. That's our quantity and price for a profit maximizing monopolist. Finally, we can also take this opportunity to calculate how much profit the company is making. At the profit maximizing quantity, you look at the price and then average total cost, right? So we're going to go down to the average total cost curve, figure out cost per unit. Price minus average total cost gives us average profit per unit. You will multiply that by how many units you're selling, quantity, in order to get total profit. Price minus average total cost times quantity gives us a rectangle that represents the profit that this company earns. So let's look at this from an allocative efficiency standpoint. Allocative efficiency would be achieved if price is equal to marginal cost. So let's check with our monopolist. Price here. Marginal cost all the way down here. Allocatively efficient? Nope, that's a fail. Allocative efficiency would be achieved if price were to fall to marginal cost. So what that means is, if you would imagine the monopolist lowering price, going down the demand curve, lowering price, lowering price, lowering price, lowering price till beep right here. If price meets marginal cost, that would be allocative efficiency. Because what we're looking at here is that at this point, everybody who values the product more than the cost of production actually gets the product, but not at the profit maximizing level. We look at the profit maximizing level. Last person that gets sold to values the product way more than the cost of production. And then over here, for example, we've got another person. They're like, hey, I'm willing to pay this much for the product. It would only cost you this much to produce it, right? I can give you way more money than the cost of production, which would be good from a social standpoint. It would generate social surplus. But the monopolist says no. The monopolist holds back on production so that the monopolist can charge a higher price. And that's basically why we don't like monopoly, because high prices, bad, right? And not everybody who values the product more than the cost of production ends up getting the product. And that concludes our discussion of monopoly. So hopefully at this point, you learned to explain natural, resource, and legal barriers to entry, how to solve the profit maximization problem for a monopolist, and how to evaluate efficiency under a monopoly. I will see you next time.